The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Diego rolled out of bed and rubbed his eyes, looking at the calendar on his nightstand. Today was different. Today, he wouldn't be heading to the garage where he spent his days fixing engines and changing oil. Today, he was going to court. He walked to his small bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. In the mirror, he saw a man who looked older than his 28 years. His hands were permanently stained with grease, no matter how hard he scrubbed them. His face showed the lines of someone who worked long hours under car hoods, squinting at engine parts in dim garage lighting. Diego had never imagined he would end up in a courtroom. 6 months ago, his biggest worry was whether Mrs. Chen's old Honda would pass inspection. Now he was about to face a judge and argue his own legal case. The thought made his stomach twist into knots. He pulled on his best clothes, a white button-down shirt his sister had given him for Christmas, and black pants he usually wore to church. The shirt was a little tight around his shoulders from years of physical work, but it was clean and pressed. He looked at himself one more time in the mirror and tried to imagine how he would appear to a judge who had probably never changed a tire in her life. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes through the early morning traffic. Diego parked his old pickup truck in the visitor lot and sat for a moment, watching other people walk toward the building. Most wore expensive suits and carried fancy briefcases. They walked with confidence like they belonged there. Diego grabbed his backpack, the same one he used to carry his tools, and took a deep breath. The courthouse was bigger than he had expected. Tall columns stretched up to a roof that seemed impossibly high. People rushed past him up the wide steps, talking on phones and checking their watches. Diego felt like he was entering a different world, one where he didn't know the rules or speak the language. Inside, the building was even more intimidating. The floors were polished marble that reflected the overhead lights. Security guards directed people through metal detectors while lawyers in expensive suits chatted in small groups. The sound of their voices echoed off the high ceilings, creating a constant buzz of conversation that Diego couldn't quite understand. He found the information desk and asked a tired-looking clerk where he needed to go. She barely looked up from her computer as she told him to take the elevator to the 3rd floor, courtroom B. The elevator was crowded with people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Diego pressed himself into a corner and tried to make himself smaller. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, Diego followed the signs down a long hallway lined with identical wooden doors. Each door had a number and the name of a judge. He found courtroom B and stopped outside. Reading the nameplate, the Honorable Patricia Whitman. Through the small window in the door, he could see people already sitting inside, waiting. Diego pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the courtroom. It was smaller than he had imagined from watching movies, but somehow more serious. Dark wood covered the walls, and everything seemed designed to make people feel the weight of the law. The judge's bench sat high above everything else, empty for now but imposing even without anyone sitting behind it. He looked around for where he was supposed to sit. The courtroom was divided into 2 sections by a low wooden barrier. Behind the barrier, several rows of benches faced the judge's bench. In front of the barrier were 2 tables where the lawyers would sit. Diego realized with a sinking feeling that he would be sitting at one of those tables alone, while his former employer would have a team of lawyers at the other. A few other people were already seated in the gallery, waiting for their cases to be called. They looked like they had been through this before. Some read newspapers, others whispered quietly with people who might have been family members. Diego took a seat in the back row and tried to calm his nerves. He opened his backpack and pulled out a worn composition notebook. Inside were hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, copied legal cases, and highlighted printouts from the library's computer. For the past 6 months since losing his job at Peterson's Auto Repair, Diego had spent every free moment studying law books and court cases. It had started accidentally. After being fired for what his boss claimed was stealing parts, Diego had gone to the public library to use the internet and look for new jobs. While waiting for a computer, he had wandered into the law section and picked up a book about employment rights. Something about the logical way the law was written had appealed to him. It reminded him of troubleshooting engine problems. You had to understand how all the parts worked together. What began as curiosity had become an obsession. Diego discovered that the library had a legal database he could access for free. He spent hours reading court cases about wrongful termination, learning the language lawyers used and understanding how judges made their decisions. He filled notebook after notebook with summaries and quotes from important cases. His family thought he had lost his mind. His sister Carmen kept telling him to just find another job and forget about Peterson's. His mother worried that he was wasting time on something he would never understand. But Diego couldn't let it go. He knew he hadn't stolen anything, and he was determined to prove it. The more he studied, the more he realized that his case was stronger than he had first thought. Peterson's had fired him without following their own written procedures. They had accused him of theft but never reported it to the police. Most importantly, Diego had discovered that 2 other Hispanic employees had been fired in the past year under similar circumstances, while white employees who had made similar mistakes kept their jobs. Now, sitting in the courtroom with his notebook full of legal research, Diego felt a mix of terror and determination. He knew he was taking a huge risk representing himself. The lawyer fees would have cost more than he made in 6 months, so he really had no choice. But part of him wondered if he was crazy to think he could stand up in front of a judge and argue law against professional attorneys. The courtroom door opened and more people filed in. Some were clearly lawyers, carrying thick briefcases and talking in hushed tones about cases and deadlines. Others looked like Diego, ordinary people caught up in the legal system trying to navigate something they barely understood. Diego looked at his watch. The court session would begin in 15 minutes. He opened his notebook one more time and reviewed his opening statement, the words he had practiced in his mirror at home dozens of times. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice in his head was steady. He might not look like a lawyer, but he had something many lawyers didn't have. He knew his case inside and out, and he was fighting for something that really mattered to him. The door at the front of the courtroom opened and a bailiff in uniform stepped out. "All rise," he called out in a loud voice. The Honorable Judge Patricia Whitman presiding. Diego stood up with everyone else, his heart pounding as he prepared to face the moment that would change everything. Judge Patricia Whitman swept into the courtroom wearing her black robes, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 52, she had been on the bench for 15 years and had seen every type of case imaginable. She settled into her high-backed chair and looked out over the courtroom with the practiced gaze of someone who could size up a situation in seconds. Her eyes moved across the gallery, noting the usual mix of lawyers, plaintiffs, and defendants waiting for their cases to be called. Then her gaze fell on the defendant's table, where Diego sat alone with his composition notebook and backpack. She had to suppress a small sigh. Another pro se defendant, another person who thought they could handle their own legal case without understanding the complexity of the law. In her experience, these cases usually ended badly for the self-represented party. They didn't understand procedure. They got emotional when they should stay logical, and they often hurt their own cases by saying too much or too little at the wrong times. Judge Whitman had developed a certain impatience with pro se defendants over the years. Not because she didn't respect their right to represent themselves, but because it often meant longer hearings, more confusion, and ultimately, frustrated people who felt the system had failed them. She preferred cases where both sides had competent counsel, who understood the rules and could move things along efficiently. At the plaintiff's table sat Robert Chen, the senior partner from Chen & Associates, one of the city's most respected employment law firms. Next to him was his associate, a young woman in an expensive suit who was organizing thick files of documents. Their table looked like a command center, laptop computers, legal briefs bound in blue covers, and neat stacks of exhibits marked with colored tabs. The contrast between the two tables couldn't have been more stark. On one side, years of legal education, resources, and experience. On the other, a mechanic with a notebook and whatever he had managed to learn from library books. "Good morning," Judge Whitman said, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "We have several matters on the docket today. First up is Peterson's Auto Repair versus Diego Morales. Is the plaintiff ready to proceed?" Robert Chen stood smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. Robert Chen for the plaintiff, Peterson's Auto Repair. We're here seeking to recover damages for theft of automotive parts by the defendant during his employment." Judge Whitman nodded and turned to Diego. "And I assume you're representing yourself, Mr. Morales?" Diego stood up, his notebook clutched in his hands. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm representing myself because I can't afford a lawyer, And because I know I didn't steal anything. The judge's expression didn't change, but several lawyers in the gallery exchanged glances. Starting with a declaration of innocence instead of a simple yes was exactly the kind of mistake pro se defendants typically made. Mr. Morales, Judge Whitman said with barely concealed impatience, we haven't begun the actual proceedings yet. Right now, I'm just establishing who's representing each party. Do you understand the difference between a preliminary hearing and the actual trial? Diego felt his face flush. Yes, Your Honor, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I disagree with their accusations. I'm sure you do. The judge replied in a tone that suggested she had heard similar protests countless times before. Mr. Chen, I assume you're prepared to proceed with the preliminary motions? We are, Your Honor. However, I should note that the defendant has requested several extensions and delays over the past month. We're concerned that he's using his pro se status to slow down the proceedings. Judge Whitman looked at Diego with a slightly annoyed expression. Mr. Morales, have you been requesting unnecessary delays? Diego opened his notebook and flipped through several pages. Your Honor, I requested 2 continuances. The first was because I needed time to review the discovery documents they provided. They gave me over 300 pages just 3 days before the original hearing date. The second was because I needed to file my own discovery requests. You filed discovery requests? Judge Whitman asked, sounding surprised. Yes, Your Honor. I requested employment records for all employees terminated in the past 2 years, as well as the company's written policies on inventory control and employee discipline. Chen shifted in his seat slightly. He hadn't expected a pro se defendant to understand discovery procedures, much less to file competent requests for relevant documents. Judge Whitman made a note on her calendar. Very well. Mr. Chen, I trust you've complied with the defendant's discovery requests? We have, Your Honor, though we question the relevance of some of the requested materials. Diego stood up again. Your Honor, may I respond to that? Sit down, Mr. Morales, Judge Whitman said firmly. We're not arguing the merits of your case right now. We're simply establishing the procedural status. She paused and looked at him more carefully. However, I am curious about something. How did you learn about discovery procedures? I've been studying employment law at the public library, Your Honor. They have legal databases I can access for free, and I've been reading court cases similar to mine. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. In the gallery, a few lawyers were now paying closer attention to the exchange. It was unusual for a pro se defendant to even know what discovery was, much less to file proper requests. Mr. Chen, Judge Whitman continued, what's your estimate for the length of today's proceedings? Given that we're dealing with a straightforward theft case and a pro se defendant, I would estimate 2 hours at most, Your Honor. Diego cleared his throat. Your Honor, with respect, this isn't a straightforward theft case. The plaintiff terminated my employment based on allegations they never reported to police. They claim I stole parts but can't produce any evidence of missing inventory, and they violated their own written disciplinary procedures in terminating me. Judge Whitman stared at Diego for a long moment. His response was more articulate than she had expected, and he seemed to understand some basic legal concepts. But she had learned not to get her hopes up too quickly with pro se defendants. Mr. Morales, do you have any legal training? No, Your Honor, I'm a mechanic. But I've spent the last 6 months studying employment law and civil procedure. Chen leaned over and whispered something to his associate, who nodded and began flipping through one of their files. Very well, Judge Whitman said. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into, Mr. Morales. Employment law is complex and you'll be going up against experienced attorneys. Are you certain you don't want to seek legal counsel? Diego stood up straighter. Your Honor, I can't afford a lawyer. I've been unemployed for 6 months because of these false accusations. But I've prepared as best I can and I believe the law and the facts are on my side. The law and the facts, Judge Whitman repeated, almost to herself. It was the kind of phrase she usually heard from lawyers, not from mechanics. In the gallery, attorney Lisa Park, who was waiting for her own case to be called, leaned forward with interest. She had been practicing employment law for 8 years and had never seen a pro se defendant speak with such apparent confidence about legal concepts. Mr. Chen, Judge Whitman said, I assume you're prepared to make your opening statement? Absolutely, Your Honor. This is a simple case of employee theft. The defendant was caught taking automotive parts from his employer's inventory without authorization. When confronted, He became defensive and made accusations of discrimination to deflect from his own wrongdoing. Diego opened his mouth to object but caught himself and remained silent. Judge Whitman noticed his restraint. "Mr. Morales, you'll have your opportunity to respond." "Mr. Chen, please continue." "The evidence will show that Mr. Morales had access to the parts inventory, that parts went missing during his shifts, and that he was unable to account for his activities during the relevant time periods. Peterson's Auto Repair is a small family business that can't afford to lose inventory to employee theft." When Chen finished, Judge Whitman turned to Diego. "Mr. Morales, you may make your opening statement." Diego stood up and opened his notebook. "Your Honor, this case isn't about theft. It's about a pattern of discriminatory treatment that Peterson's Auto Repair has used against Hispanic employees. The evidence will show that I was terminated without following the company's own written procedures, that no police report was ever filed despite allegations of theft, and that similar accusations have been made against other Hispanic employees while comparable conduct by non-Hispanic employees resulted in no disciplinary action." The courtroom was suddenly very quiet. Judge Whitman found herself paying close attention for the first time since the proceedings began. Diego's opening statement was structured like a lawyer's, touching on burden of proof and pattern evidence. Chen was now looking at Diego with a different expression. Not the dismissive confidence he had shown earlier, but the wary attention of a lawyer who realized his opponent might not be as easy to defeat as he had assumed. Judge Whitman made another note and looked at the clock. Something told her this case might take longer than 2 hours after all. Attorney Robert Chen stood up and straightened his tie with the confidence of someone who had won dozens of similar cases. He had been practicing employment law for 20 years, and he had never lost a case against a pro se defendant. In his experience, people who represented themselves usually made so many procedural errors that the actual facts of the case became irrelevant. "Your Honor," Chen began, "I'd like to call my first witness Thomas Peterson, the owner of Peterson's Auto Repair." A stocky man in his 50s walked to the witness stand. He wore a button-down shirt that was clean but showed the wear of someone who worked with his hands. Peterson raised his right hand and was sworn in by the bailiff. "Mr. Peterson," Chen said, "please tell the court about your experience with the defendant, Diego Morales." Peterson shifted in his seat and looked toward Diego briefly before answering. "Well, Diego worked for me for about 3 years. He was a decent mechanic, I'll give him that. But toward the end, we started having problems with missing parts." "What kind of problems?" "Small things at first. A few spark plugs here, some oil filters there. Nothing that would break the bank, but it was happening regularly. Then we noticed some bigger items going missing. Brake rotors, a starter motor, that kind of thing." Chen nodded sympathetically. "And did you connect these missing items to Mr. Morales?" "It took a while, but yeah. The pattern was that parts would go missing on days when Diego was working alone or closing up the shop. Plus, he had access to everything because he was one of my senior mechanics." Diego scribbled notes in his composition notebook, occasionally glancing up at Peterson. His face showed no emotion, but his pen moved quickly across the pages. "Mr. Peterson," Chen continued, "did you confront Mr. Morales about these missing parts?" "I did. I called him into my office and asked him directly if he knew anything about the missing inventory. He got real defensive, started talking about how he was being singled out because he's Hispanic. That's when I knew something was up." Judge Whitman watched Diego carefully as Peterson testified. Most pro se defendants would be getting agitated by now, maybe even interrupting the testimony. But Diego just kept taking notes, his expression focused and calm. "And what action did you take?" Chen asked. "I had to let him go. I couldn't have someone working for me who I couldn't trust around the inventory. It's a small business, every part matters." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. No further questions." Judge Whitman turned to Diego. "Mr. Morales, you may cross-examine the witness." Diego stood up slowly, his notebook in hand. He looked at Peterson for a moment, then at his notes. "Mr. Peterson," Diego began, "you testified that parts went missing on days when I was working alone. Do you have any documentation showing which specific days I worked alone?" Peterson looked a little confused by the question. "Well, no. I don't keep detailed records of who works when. But you told Mr. Chen that there was a pattern connected to my shifts. How did you establish that pattern without keeping records?" Chen started to object but stopped. The question was proper and Peterson needed to answer it. I remembered when things went missing, Peterson said, sounding less confident than before. Diego flipped a page in his notebook. Mr. Peterson, according to the employee schedule that you provided in Discovery, I worked alone only 6 times in my last 3 months of employment. Is that correct? Peterson looked uncomfortable. I don't remember the exact number. But you reviewed your own records before testifying today, didn't you? Well, yes, but... And according to those same records, I actually worked fewer solo shifts than 2 other employees during that same period. Did you suspect them of theft as well? Judge Whitman found herself leaning forward slightly. Diego's questions were methodical and based on actual documentation. She could see Chen looking through his papers, apparently searching for the schedule Diego was referencing. Mr. Peterson, Diego continued, you mentioned that you confronted me about the missing parts. Do you remember what I told you? You said you didn't take anything and that I was picking on you. Did I also tell you that I had seen another employee, Kevin Walsh, taking parts from inventory without signing them out? Peterson's face flushed slightly. You made some accusations, yes. And did you investigate those accusations? Kevin's been with me for 8 years. He's like family. That's not what I asked, Mr. Peterson. Did you investigate the specific incident I reported to you? Peterson was quiet for a moment. No, I didn't. Diego made a note and continued. Mr. Peterson, when you decided to terminate my employment, did you follow the progressive discipline policy outlined in your employee handbook? Chen stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The witness isn't a legal expert on employment procedures. Judge Whitman looked at Diego, expecting him to back down. Instead, he opened his notebook to a specific page. Your Honor, I'm not asking for a legal opinion. I'm asking about his company's own written policies, which were provided in Discovery, and which Mr. Peterson presumably knows as the owner of the business. Overruled, Judge Whitman said, somewhat surprised by Diego's competent response to the objection. The witness may answer. Peterson looked at Chen, who could only nod for him to continue. What do you mean by progressive discipline? Your employee handbook states that disciplinary action should normally proceed through verbal warning, written warning, suspension, and then termination. Did you give me a verbal warning about the alleged theft? No. A written warning? No. A suspension? No. So you went directly to termination without following any of the steps outlined in your own policy? Peterson was now clearly uncomfortable. This was theft we were talking about. That's grounds for immediate termination. Diego nodded and flipped to another page. Mr. Peterson, did you file a police report about this alleged theft? No. Why not? I just wanted to handle it internally. But if you were certain that theft had occurred, wouldn't you want to report it to authorities? Chen objected again. Speculation, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Whitman said, but she was watching Diego with increasing interest. His questions were building a coherent narrative, not just random challenges to the testimony. Mr. Peterson, Diego continued, in the 3 years I worked for you, did you ever have any complaints about the quality of my work? No, your work was fine. Did you ever discipline me for attendance problems? No. Safety violations? No. Customer complaints? No. So the only issue you claim to have had with my performance was this alleged theft in my final weeks of employment? That's right. Diego closed his notebook and looked directly at Peterson. Mr. Peterson, if you had no documentation of missing inventory, no police report, and no evidence directly connecting me to any theft, why did you decide I was guilty? Peterson opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. Chen was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized his witness was not performing as expected. The timing seemed suspicious, Peterson finally said. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, no further questions. As Peterson left the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted noticeably. What had begun as a routine case against an overmatched prosa defendant was starting to look more complicated. In the gallery, attorney Lisa Park was taking notes of her own. She had seen experienced lawyers conduct less effective cross-examinations than what Diego had just delivered. Judge Whitman looked at the clock and then at Chen. Mr. Chen, do you have additional witnesses? Yes, Your Honor, I'd like to call Kevin Walsh, one of Mr. Peterson's mechanics. Diego looked up sharply at the name. As Walsh walked to the witness stand, Diego opened his notebook to a section marked with a yellow sticky note. Whatever was written there seemed to make him sit up straighter in his chair. Chen might have won the opening round. But the first real surprise had clearly gone to Diego. And from the look on his face as he prepared for the next witness, Judge Whitman suspected there might be more surprises coming. Kevin Walsh walked to the witness stand with the swagger of someone who felt completely confident about his testimony. At 35, he had worked at Peterson's Auto Repair for 8 years and considered himself the senior mechanic. He had thick arms from years of working under car hoods and a beard that he kept trimmed but never quite clean. As Walsh was sworn in, Diego watched him carefully. During his months of preparation, Diego had done more than just study law books. He had also thought carefully about every person who worked at Peterson's, every interaction he had witnessed, and every detail that might be relevant to his case. "Mr. Walsh," Attorney Chen began, "how long have you worked with the defendant, Diego Morales?" "About 3 years since he started at Peterson's." "And what was your working relationship with him?" Walsh shrugged. "It was fine, I guess. We worked different shifts most of the time, so we didn't interact much. But he seemed okay. Did you ever notice anything suspicious about Mr. Morales' behavior around the parts inventory?" "Well, now that you mention it, yeah. Sometimes I'd come in for my shift and notice that parts were in different places than where I'd left them, like someone had been going through the inventory after hours." Judge Whitman noticed that Diego was writing furiously in his notebook, occasionally underlining something with sharp strokes. "Mr. Walsh, did you ever see Mr. Morales take parts without proper authorization?" "Not directly, no. But there were times when I couldn't find parts that should have been there, and Diego was the only other person who had been in the shop." Chen nodded with satisfaction. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh. No further questions." Judge Whitman turned to Diego. "Mr. Morales, you may cross-examine." Diego stood up and opened his notebook to the section marked with the yellow sticky note. For a moment, he just looked at Walsh without speaking. "Mr. Walsh," Diego finally said, "you testified that you and I worked different shifts most of the time. Is that accurate?" "Yeah, that's right. According to the work schedules provided in Discovery, we actually worked overlapping shifts about 60% of the time during my last 6 months of employment." "Were you mistaken about working different shifts?" Walsh looked a little annoyed. "Maybe we overlapped some, but I was usually doing different work than you." Diego flipped a page in his notebook. "Mr. Walsh, you mentioned that parts would be in different places than where you left them. Do you have a specific system for organizing parts inventory?" "Not really. I just put things where they make sense." "So if someone else organized parts differently than you would, that might seem suspicious to you, even if they were following proper procedures?" "I guess so." "Mr. Walsh, are you familiar with Peterson's written inventory control procedures?" Walsh shifted in his seat. "We don't really follow written procedures for that stuff. Tom just wants us to keep track of what we use." Judge Whitman was paying close attention now. Diego's question seemed to be heading somewhere specific. "So when you say parts were in the wrong places, you're really saying they weren't where you personally would have put them?" "Look, I know how the shop should be organized. I've been there longer than anyone except Tom." Diego nodded and made a note. "Mr. Walsh, during your 8 years at Peterson's, have you ever taken parts home for personal use?" Chen started to object, but Walsh answered quickly. "Sometimes Tom lets us take small stuff if we need it for our own cars. Nothing wrong with that." "And do you always get written authorization before taking parts home?" Walsh looked uncomfortable. "Tom knows about it. We have an understanding. But no written authorization?" "No." Diego flipped to another page. "Mr. Walsh, do you remember the day in January when you took brake rotors home for your truck?" Walsh's face changed completely. The confidence was gone, replaced by something close to panic. "I don't know what you're talking about. You don't remember borrowing brake rotors from shop inventory to replace the ones on your Ford F-150? I paid Tom back for those. When did you pay him back?" Walsh was silent for a long moment. "I was going to pay him back." Judge Whitman found herself completely focused on the exchange. This was not what she had expected from a pro se defendant. "Mr. Walsh, you took those rotors on January 15th. Do you remember what happened the next day?" "No." Diego opened his notebook to a specific page. "January 16th was the first day that Mr. Peterson claims parts went missing from inventory. Does that seem like a coincidence to you?" Chen stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness can't be asked to speculate about coincidences." "Sustained," Judge Whitman said, but she was looking at Diego with new respect. Mr. Walsh, Diego continued, how many other times in the past year have you taken parts home without written authorization? I don't keep track of that stuff. More than 5 times? Walsh didn't answer. More than 10 times? Still no answer. Mr. Walsh, when Mr. Peterson questioned employees about missing inventory, did you tell him about the parts you had taken home? That's different. Tom knows I'm good for it. That's not what I asked. Did you tell him? No. Diego closed his notebook and looked directly at Walsh. Mr. Walsh, when I reported to Mr. Peterson that I had seen you taking parts without signing them out, what did you tell Mr. Peterson about that conversation? Walsh glanced toward Chen, who couldn't help him now. I told him you were trying to cause trouble. Did you tell him that what I reported was true? I told him you were just trying to save your own skin. But you didn't deny that I had seen you taking parts? Yes or no, Mr. Walsh, did you deny that I had seen you taking parts without authorization? Walsh was quiet for a long moment. No, I didn't deny it. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Chen was staring at his witness with something approaching disbelief. Diego opened his notebook one more time. Mr. Walsh, in your 8 years at Peterson's Auto Repair, how many Hispanic employees have you worked with? Objection, Chen said quickly. Relevance? Judge Whitman looked at Diego. Mr. Morales, where is this line of questioning going? Your Honor, it goes to the credibility of the witness and potential bias in his testimony. I'll allow it, but get to the point quickly. Mr. Walsh, how many Hispanic employees have you worked with at Peterson's? I don't know. A few, I guess. Would you say you've had good working relationships with Hispanic employees? Walsh looked angry now. I don't care what color people are. I judge people by their work. Diego nodded. Mr. Walsh, do you remember telling me last November that Peterson's was hiring too many of you people? I never said that. You don't remember a conversation we had in the break room where you complained about Hispanic employees getting hired? No, I don't remember anything like that. Diego made a final note and closed his notebook. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. No further questions. As Walsh left the witness stand, he avoided eye contact with everyone in the courtroom. The damage to Chen's case was obvious to everyone present. Judge Whitman looked at Diego with something approaching amazement. In 20 minutes of cross-examination, he had systematically destroyed the credibility of a key witness, established alternative explanations for the missing inventory, and introduced evidence of potential bias and discrimination. In the gallery, Attorney Lisa Park was no longer just taking notes. She was staring at Diego with the fascination of someone watching a masterclass in trial advocacy. Chen gathered his papers with hands that weren't quite steady. He had tried dozens of cases against pro-se defendants, and none of them had ever prepared him for something like this. Judge Whitman looked at the clock and then at both parties. Given the complexity of the testimony we've heard today, I think we should take a brief recess before proceeding further. As people filed out of the courtroom, Diego remained seated at the defendant's table, reviewing his notes for the next phase of the case. But the transformation was complete. No one in that courtroom would ever again underestimate the mechanic with the composition notebook. After the 15-minute recess, the atmosphere in courtroom B had completely changed. Word had spread through the courthouse about the mechanic who was representing himself with surprising skill. Several attorneys who had finished their own cases lingered in the gallery, curious to see how the proceedings would conclude. Judge Whitman returned to the bench with a different demeanor. Gone was the barely concealed impatience she had shown toward Diego at the beginning of the day. She looked at him now with the same professional attention she gave to experienced attorneys. Mr. Chen, she said, do you have additional witnesses? Attorney Robert Chen stood up, his confidence clearly shaken by what had happened during Kevin Walsh's testimony. Your Honor, I'd like to call Maria Santos, who handles inventory tracking at Peterson's Auto Repair. A woman in her 40s approached the witness stand. She wore a simple dress and moved with the careful precision of someone who spent her days working with numbers and details. Ms. Santos, Chen began after she was sworn in, what are your responsibilities at Peterson's Auto Repair? I handle the paperwork, invoices, inventory tracking, payroll, things like that. Are you responsible for monitoring parts inventory? I keep track of what we order and what gets used for customer jobs. But the mechanics are supposed to report what they take from stock. Chen nodded. Did you notice any discrepancies in inventory during Mr. Morales' employment? Well, yes. Starting around January, we had parts that should have been in stock but weren't there when mechanics looked for them. Thank you, Mrs. Santos. Your witness, Mr. Morales. Diego stood up and opened his notebook to a section filled with numbers and calculations. Mrs. Santos, when you say you noticed discrepancies starting in January, do you mean that no discrepancies occurred before then? Santos looked thoughtful. No, we always have some discrepancies. Mechanics sometimes forget to write things down or parts get misplaced. So inventory discrepancies were normal at Peterson's? Yes, but they seemed to get worse in January. Diego flipped a page. Ms. Santos, I'm looking at the inventory reports you provided in Discovery. According to these numbers, inventory discrepancies in January were actually lower than they were in October and November of the previous year. Are you sure they got worse? Santos looked confused. I don't have those reports in front of me. Judge Whitman interrupted. Mr. Morales, do you have copies of those reports? Yes, Your Honor. Diego walked to the clerk and handed over a stack of papers. These are the monthly inventory reports that Ms. Santos herself prepared, provided to me in Discovery. Judge Whitman reviewed the documents quickly. Ms. Santos, looking at these reports, do you see what Mr. Morales is referring to? Santos studied the papers for a moment. Oh, yes, I see. The January numbers are actually better than some previous months. So your testimony about discrepancies getting worse in January was inaccurate? I guess I remembered it wrong. Diego nodded. Ms. Santos, during my 3 years of employment, did you ever receive any complaints from Mr. Peterson about my work? No. Did you ever have to counsel me about failing to properly document parts usage? No. Was my timesheet accuracy better or worse than other mechanics? Better. You were always very careful about documenting your hours. Thank you, Ms. Santos. No further questions. Chen decided not to call any additional witnesses. The case he had thought would be straightforward was falling apart, and each witness seemed to be helping Diego more than the plaintiff. Your Honor, Chen said, the plaintiff rests. Judge Whitman turned to Diego. Mr. Morales, you may present your defense. Diego stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. For a moment he just stood there, looking at the judge and the gallery filled with attorneys who were now watching him with genuine interest. Your Honor, I'd like to call myself as a witness. This was unusual but not unheard of in civil cases. Diego walked to the witness stand and was sworn in, then returned to the podium to question himself. A procedure that looked strange but was perfectly legal. State your name for the record. Diego Morales. How long did you work at Peterson's Auto Repair? 3 years and 2 months. For the next 20 minutes, Diego methodically told his story. He described his work performance, his relationships with co-workers, and the events leading up to his termination. But more importantly, he presented evidence that he had carefully gathered over 6 months of preparation. He introduced time cards showing that the missing parts Walsh had mentioned disappeared on days when Diego wasn't even working. He presented documentation of the progressive discipline policy that Peterson had ignored. He showed photographs of the disorganized inventory system that made accurate tracking nearly impossible. Most significantly, he presented evidence of a pattern of discrimination. Using employment records obtained through Discovery, Diego showed that in the past 2 years, Peterson's had terminated 3 Hispanic employees for alleged policy violations, while retaining non-Hispanic employees who had committed similar or worse infractions. Your Honor, Diego said, wrapping up his testimony, I didn't steal anything from Peterson's Auto Repair. I was terminated because I reported misconduct by a favored employee, and because Mr. Peterson was looking for an excuse to get rid of another Hispanic worker. When Diego finished, Judge Whitman looked at Attorney Chen. Do you wish to cross-examine? Chen stood up reluctantly. He had been practicing law for 20 years, but he felt completely outmatched by a mechanic with 6 months of library research. Mr. Morales, Chen began, you've presented a lot of theories and accusations today, but can you prove you didn't take those parts? Diego looked at him calmly. Mr. Chen, in American law, the burden of proof is on the person making the accusation. You have to prove that I did take the parts, and you haven't presented any evidence that I did. No witnesses who saw me take anything. No documentation of missing inventory on days I worked. No police reports, nothing. Chen tried a few more questions. but each one only gave Diego another opportunity to point out the weaknesses in the plaintiff's case. Finally, Chen sat down. No further questions. Judge Whitman looked at both parties. Are you ready for closing arguments? Chen's closing was brief and weak. He could only repeat his original accusations and hope the judge would believe Peterson's version of events, despite all the contradictory evidence Diego had presented. Diego's closing was masterful. He systematically reviewed the evidence, cited relevant employment law cases, and explained why the law required a judgment in his favor. He spoke without notes, having memorized the key legal principles that applied to his case. Your Honor, Diego concluded, this case is about more than just one job or one worker. It's about whether employees can be fired based on unsupported accusations, whether companies have to follow their own written policies, and whether workers have the right to report misconduct without retaliation. The law is clear on all these points, and I respectfully ask for judgment in my favor. Judge Whitman took only 10 minutes to deliberate. In 30 years of legal practice and 15 years on the bench, she began, I have rarely seen such thorough preparation and skillful advocacy. Mr. Morales, your presentation today has been exemplary. She turned to Chen. Mr. Chen, your client failed to meet its burden of proof. The evidence presented suggests that Mr. Morales was terminated in violation of the company's own policies and possibly as retaliation for reporting misconduct by another employee. Judge Whitman looked back at Diego. Judgment for the defendant. Mr. Morales, you are entitled to back pay, damages for emotional distress, and attorney's fees, though I suppose in your case, that would be compensation for your own time and research. As Diego packed his composition notebook, people approached him from all directions. Attorney Lisa Park introduced herself and offered him a job as a paralegal. 2 other lawyers left their business cards. The court reporter told him she had never seen anything like his performance, but the moment that meant the most came when Judge Whitman called him to the bench. After the courtroom had mostly cleared. Mr. Morales, she said quietly, have you ever considered law school? Diego smiled. Actually, Your Honor, I've already applied to the evening program at the State University. I got my acceptance letter last week. Judge Whitman smiled back. Something tells me you're going to be an excellent lawyer. As Diego walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunlight, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a mechanic who had never set foot in a courtroom. Today, he had won a legal case against experienced attorneys using nothing but determination, preparation, and the belief that everyone deserves justice under the law. His phone rang. It was his sister Carmen. Diego, I heard you won. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Carmen. But you know what? This is just the beginning. He looked back at the courthouse one more time, then walked toward his truck. In 3 years, he would be back in these hallways, not as a defendant representing himself, but as an attorney representing others who needed someone to fight for them. Sometimes the most unlikely people surprise everyone, including themselves. And sometimes, all it takes is the courage to stand up and prove that knowledge, preparation, and justice can triumph over assumptions and prejudice.